At dawn, they came to arrest the Knights Templar. The king had issued the order. The prisons were ready. The executions were planned. But something was wrong. When royal soldiers reached the ports, the ships were gone. Every Templar vessel vanished in a single night. No alarms. No witnesses. No records explaining how hundreds of knights escaped justice. What did they know in advance? Who warned them? And more importantly, what secret left with them across the sea in 1307? Because this wasn't just an escape, it was a disappearance so complete that justice itself was never seen again. I was awake before the bells rang. Not because I expected trouble, but because the night felt wrong. There are moments when silence grows heavy, as if the air itself is holding its breath. That was how Paris felt on the night of October 12, 1307. I remember the streets before dawn, still wet from a late rain, lantern light trembling on stone walls, guards moving faster than usual, their armor muted with cloth so it would not clatter. No one said why. Orders had been given, but they were sealed. Even the men carrying them did not know their full meaning, only that they were to be opened at sunrise, only that they came directly from the king. I was not a knight. I was not a soldier. I was a clerk who copied records for merchants near the river. But when you live close to power, you feel its movements before you understand them. That night, the city did not sleep. At first light, the bells rang, not for prayer, but for authority. Doors were struck. Names were read. Men in white cloaks were dragged into the streets before they could lace their boots. The Knights Templar. They had been part of the city for generations. Bankers. Warriors. Monks bound by vows of poverty and obedience. They walked calmly among us, confident in royal protection. Or so we believed. By noon, every major Templar house in France had been seized. Not just Paris. All at once. As if the entire kingdom had inhaled and struck in a single breath. The accusations spread quickly. Heresy. Idolatry. Secret rituals whispered in the dark. Some said the charges were absurd. Others said the Templars had always been too powerful, too rich, too untouchable. But the speed of it all frightened everyone. Justice, when real, moves slowly. This moved like a blade. King Philip IV had planned this for years. That much became clear later. He was deeply in debt to the Templars. And kings do not enjoy owing money to men who answer to no crown. By declaring them enemies of God, he made himself their judge and their executioner. Yet something strange happened that morning. Something few noticed at first. As lists were checked and prisoners counted, messengers arrived from the coast. From La Rochelle. From ports along the Atlantic. They carried reports that made no sense. The Templar ships were gone. Not seized. Not burned. Gone. La Rochelle had been the Order's most important harbor. A place watched by the crown. A place where ships did not simply vanish. But the docks were empty. Ropes still hung where vessels should have been. Warehouses stood unlocked, untouched. No signs of panic. No broken locks. Just absence. At first, officials assumed delay. Bad tides. Clerical errors. But by nightfall, denial gave way to fear. I heard this not from a herald, but from a man who drank too much and spoke too freely. A junior officer attached to the royal treasury. He said the king's advisors were furious. Because the plan had been perfect. Too perfect. The arrests had been coordinated to the hour. The accounts frozen. The commanders captured. But the fleet, the most important piece, had slipped away. That meant one thing. The Templars had known. This is where the story changes. Because justice assumes ignorance. It assumes surprise. What happened in 1307 was not justice. It was revenge. And revenge depends on secrecy. Yet someone had whispered. I later learned that some Templars did not resist arrest. They went quietly. almost calmly, as if they had already accepted their fate. Others smiled. Not in defiance, not in madness, but in relief. That detail stayed with me, because men facing execution do not smile unless they believe something has been saved. The prisons filled quickly. Stone cells meant for criminals now held knights who had once commanded armies. Interrogations began almost immediately. Under pressure, some confessed to anything asked of them. Others remained silent, even under pain. But none spoke of the fleet. It was as if the ships no longer existed. Meanwhile, the king's anger grew. He demanded answers. He demanded names. Who had warned them? Who had broken royal secrecy? No one came forward. I remember walking near the river days later. The Seine moved slowly, carrying leaves and debris toward the sea. I watched it longer than usual. Because all roads lead somewhere. And so do rivers. If the ships were gone, they had gone west. Into the Atlantic. Into uncertainty. That terrified the court. Not because the Templars might survive, but because of what they might carry with them. For decades, the Order had guarded treasures. Not gold alone, but documents. Relics. Records of debts owed by kings and popes alike. Power written on parchment is still power. And now, it was unaccounted for. Rumors began almost immediately. Some said the fleet sailed to Scotland, where the king's authority was weak. Others whispered of Portugal. A few dared to say the ships went farther than anyone imagined. Those who spoke too loudly were silenced. Not executed. Just warned. History, I learned, is shaped as much by what is not written as by what is. Weeks passed. Executions followed. Grand Master Jacques de Molay would later be burned alive. Confessions would be recanted. The order would be officially dissolved. On paper, justice was complete. But no one ever explained the fleet. No royal record lists the seized ships. No inventory accounts for their cargo. No chronicler of the time describes their capture. It is as if, at the moment power reached for them, the sea closed its hand. Years later, I left Paris. I traveled as far as the coast myself. I stood on those empty docks. Old sailors told me the same story, though their words differed. They said the ships left at night. No torches. No bells. Only stars. They said the crews were calm. Prepared. As if every man knew exactly where he was going. And they said one more thing. The fleet did not scatter. It sailed together. That detail matters. Because men fleeing chaos do not move in formation. Only men following a plan do. This was not an escape born of fear. It was an evacuation executed with discipline. Which raises the question history still avoids. If the king planned for years, who planned longer? By the time I understood the weight of that question, it was already dangerous to ask it aloud. So I wrote instead. Quietly. Carefully. Because what vanished that night was not only a fleet. It was the king's certainty. And once certainty is lost, power begins to rot from the inside. Justice had been announced. But justice had not been delivered. And the sea kept its secret. After the arrests, the city tried to return to its habits. Markets reopened. Bells rang for prayer again. Bread was baked. Wine was poured. But nothing felt settled. The absence of the Templars was louder than their presence had ever been. Their houses stood sealed. Their symbols were scraped from doors. Men crossed themselves when passing places where white cloaks once moved without fear. I stayed quiet. A clerk survives by listening, not speaking. And there was much to hear. The first whispers came from servants. Then from guards. Then from men who had once worn the Red Cross themselves. They spoke carefully. Always indoors. Always after sunset. They said the order had changed in its final years. Not outwardly. The rituals were the same. The prayers unchanged. But inside, something had tightened. The Templars had grown used to danger. They were born in war and matured in it. Yet the danger they felt in France was different. It had no face. Some said the Grand Master himself sensed it. That Jacques de Molay had noticed the king's visits grow colder. That debts were discussed more often than devotion. Others claimed certain commanders had begun moving records. Not destroying them. Reorganizing them. As if preparing for absence. One former brother, released before the mass arrests, spoke to me weeks later. He had been injured years before and lived quietly near the river. His beard was long. His eyes never stopped moving. He said the whispers began with questions. Not about faith. But about loyalty. Who could be trusted with silence? Who asked too many questions? Who had family ties to the crown? He said meetings were held without minutes. Conversations without witnesses. And always, the same phrase returned. Not all walls are made of stone. I did not understand that then. I do now. The order was decentralized by necessity. Each commandery held autonomy, but all answered to the same rule. That rule had always protected them. Now, it became their shield. If one house fell, another could endure. But endurance requires preparation. In the months before the arrests, unusual movements were noted. Ships resupplied without reason. Cargo moved at night. Ledgers copied twice. Nothing illegal. Nothing that could be seized as proof. Only redundancy. The king's spies noticed this, of course. But spies look for treason, not foresight. One whisper, repeated often, spoke of a letter. Not from Rome. Not from the Grand Master. From no name at all. It warned of a date. No accusation. No demand. Just a warning. Whether the letter existed or not mattered less than what followed. Certain knights were transferred suddenly. Certain ports were prioritized. Certain ships were staffed with experienced crews. No announcement was made. No panic allowed. That discipline is what saved them. Because fear spreads faster than truth. Inside the prisons, interrogations continued. The men taken first had known they would be taken. They had been chosen for that purpose. I heard this from a jailer who drank himself into honesty. He said some prisoners arrived calm. Almost relieved. As if their role had been completed. When questioned about assets, they claimed ignorance. When pressed about ships, they shrugged. Ask the sea, one of them said. The king's men believed torture would break them. It did not. Pain breaks bodies. It does not always break loyalty. Meanwhile, outside the cells, the silence spread. No letter from the fleet arrived. No ransom demanded. No demands issued. The ships had not escaped to negotiate. They had escaped to vanish. That difference haunted the court. Because disappearance removes leverage. As weeks passed, whispers turned to rumors. Some claimed the order had always planned for this. That its true strength was never in France. Others believed the fleet carried more than men. That certain relics had been moved long before the arrests. I once asked an old archivist what kind of relic could frighten a king. He smiled sadly. Paper, he said. Paper remembers. Debts. Agreements. Favors repaid in silence. If the fleet carried copies of such records, the balance of power shifted beyond reach. That is why no effort was spared to find them. Messengers were sent across Europe. Allies questioned. Ports inspected. But without a destination, every search failed. The whispers grew darker. They said the order had been divided. That some brothers did not know the plan. That sacrifice had been calculated. That idea disturbed me most. Because it meant the arrests were not entirely a surprise. They were part of the design. Those taken were meant to buy time. Justice demands fairness. This demanded precision. As winter deepened, executions increased. Confessions were displayed publicly. The crown declared victory. Yet victory rang hollow, because power hates unanswered questions. I walked often near the Templar houses. I watched guards who no longer knew what they guarded. A building without people becomes a shell quickly. Inside those walls, the order had whispered, planned, prepared. Outside, the king's justice performed its theater. But somewhere beyond the horizon, the real outcome was already underway. The whispers told of an oath. Spoken quietly. Not written. That whatever survived must remain hidden. Not to rule. Not to conquer. But to endure. I began to understand then. The Templars did not flee to escape death. They fled to preserve something that could not survive fire or confession. And once that thought took root, I could not ignore it. Because it meant history, as we would know it, was incomplete by design. The order had not ended. It had simply gone silent. The warning did not arrive with ceremony. There was no seal. No signature. No authority attached to it. That is why it worked. I learned of it months later, not from a knight or a noble, but from a man who swept floors in a house that no longer existed. He was old. Bent. The kind of man people look through instead of at. He told me he had been cleaning a chamber in a Templar commandery near the coast when a rider arrived after midnight. No banner. No escort. The rider did not ask for the commander. He asked for silence. They spoke briefly. Quietly. Then the rider left the way he came. Before dawn, orders were given. Not shouted. Not written. Just spoken. Ships were to be ready. Supplies doubled. Certain chests moved first. The old man did not know what was said between the rider and the commander. But he knew what followed. Men who asked questions were sent away. Men who listened were kept close. That is how warnings survive. The king's order was meant to open at sunrise on October 13th. But warnings do not need dates to act. They only need belief. Inside the order, belief was already strained. The Templars had survived betrayal before. They had watched kingdoms rise and collapse. They understood that protection granted by power could be withdrawn overnight. Some believed the warning came from Rome. Others believed it came from within the court itself. I suspect it came from someone who stood between both worlds. Because the warning did not say why. It said when. And that made all the difference. In the days that followed, the order did not panic. That would have exposed them. Instead, they rehearsed obedience. Knights attended services. Commanders dined publicly. Nothing changed on the surface. But beneath that calm, everything moved. I was told the warning was shared only once. Spoken in a circle. Never repeated word for word. Those who heard it passed its meaning, not its message. Prepare without appearing prepared. That is the hardest instruction to follow. It requires trust. Not blind trust. Earned trust. The order had spent decades deciding who deserved that. By the time the arrests came, the warning had already done its work. Ships had been repositioned. Cargo disguised as trade goods. Crews rotated so no one knew the full picture. Each man knew only his part. That is why torture failed later. You cannot extract what was never given. I once asked myself why the king did not anticipate this. The answer is simple. He believed fear would paralyze them. But fear only paralyzes those who have no plan. The warning had given them one. The most troubling part came later. I learned that not all Templars were warned. Some were left behind deliberately. Not as punishment. As necessity. If every knight had vanished, suspicion would have followed immediately. Ports would have been closed. The fleet hunted. Instead, arrests gave the illusion of success. Justice must be seen to work. Those taken became proof. I do not know how many understood this as they were chained. But some did. That explains the calm. The smiles. They believed they were holding the door long enough for others to pass through. That belief is stronger than fear. The warning, then, was not just information. It was a test. Who would accept silence? Who would accept sacrifice? Those who could not were spared the burden of knowing. That is the cruelty of preparation. It chooses. As the fleet gathered, no prayers were said aloud. No farewells exchanged. Emotion creates memory. Memory leaves traces. Instead, men boarded ships as if beginning another routine voyage. The sea was calm that night. Too calm. Those who witnessed the departure later said the ships moved without sound. Oars dipped slowly. Sails rose like shadows. No signal fire marked their leaving. Only stars. The warning had been precise enough to avoid pursuit, and vague enough to protect its source. That is how real secrets travel. When dawn came and arrests began, the king believed he had won. The warning ensured that belief would survive just long enough. By the time the absence of the fleet was noticed, it was too late. Distance had replaced proximity. Confusion replaced certainty. And whoever had sent the warning had vanished along with them. That is the detail historians struggle with. Because a warning implies knowledge. And knowledge implies proximity to power. Someone close enough to hear the king's plan. And brave enough to betray it. I have often wondered what became of that person. Perhaps they boarded one of the ships. Perhaps they stayed behind. Perhaps they were never meant to be remembered. Warnings do not need witnesses. They only need to arrive. And on that night, one did. The first official report arrived from La Rochelle. It was brief. Uncertain. Written twice, as if the author hoped the second version would explain what the first could not. The docks are empty. No mention of struggle. No sign of theft. No trace of fire or pursuit. Just absence. La Rochelle was not a forgotten port. It was the crown's window to the Atlantic. Watched. Counted. Taxed. Ships did not vanish there by accident. When royal inspectors arrived days later, they found ropes coiled neatly. Barrels stacked and sealed. Marks on the waterline where hulls had rested for years. Everything suggested departure. Nothing suggested haste. I traveled there myself weeks later, drawn by the silence more than curiosity. The sea air carried the smell of salt and tar. Gulls cried above empty piers, confused by the lack of men. An old harbor master walked with me. He spoke slowly, choosing words like fragile cargo. They left with the tide, he said. Not against it. Not before it. With it. That detail mattered. A hurried escape ignores tides. A planned one depends on them. The harbor master said no horns were blown. No watches alerted. No authority challenged. The fleet had left as if permitted. That is what frightened the officials most. Because permission implies complicity. Every ship had been crewed by men who knew the waters. Men who understood currents and storms. Men who had sailed under Templar command for years. No replacements were needed. No questions asked. When asked why no one stopped them, the harbor master looked away. Who stops a thing they've always seen? The Templars had been part of the rhythm of the port. Their departures routine. Their arrivals expected. That night was no different, until it was. Word spread to other harbors. Bordeaux. Bayonne. Ports further south. The pattern repeated. Empty docks. Unbroken seals. No witnesses willing to speak openly. Some claimed they slept through it. Others claimed they saw nothing. A few admitted they saw the ships and said nothing. Silence is easier when fear points in more than one direction. The Crown demanded answers. Harbor officials were questioned. Punishments threatened. But you cannot punish absence. Maps were unfurled. Possible routes traced. North toward England. South toward Iberia. West into open water. Each option carried risks. England was hostile. Spain uncertain. The open Atlantic unforgiving. Yet the fleet had taken that risk, which meant they expected something better than safety at the other end. That thought unsettled everyone. I spoke with sailors who refused to take new contracts afterward. Men who had seen enough. They said the ships were heavy. Low in the water. Not overloaded. Weighted. Whatever they carried was dense. Important. And they guarded it like life itself. Some said the fleet did not scatter after leaving port. It formed a line. That detail returned again and again. Formation implies command. Command implies leadership. The Grand Master had been arrested inland. So who gave the final order? This question went unanswered. The harbors became places of quiet speculation. Men spoke in half sentences. The sea had always been dangerous. Now it felt complicit. As weeks passed, the king's certainty began to crack. He had seized land. He had seized gold. He had seized men. But the thing he needed most, control, had slipped beyond reach. Justice without control is theater. The public saw trials, confessions, executions. But inside the court, panic grew. Because ships do not disappear without leaving stories. And stories were spreading. Some claimed the fleet sailed under false flags. Others said they split after the horizon. A few dared to whisper that the ships went farther west than any Christian fleet had reason to go. That idea was dismissed officially. Unofficially, it terrified them. The Atlantic was still largely unknown, unmapped, unclaimed. If the Templars had sailed into it deliberately, they were not fleeing, they were choosing exile on their own terms. That is a dangerous thing for power to accept. The harbors remained empty. Guards were posted for months after. Too late. Ships came and went. Trade resumed. But the absence remained visible to those who knew where to look. Every empty mooring marked a question the Crown could not answer. I stood on the pier one evening as the sun lowered into the water. The horizon swallowed light slowly. I understood then why the sea had always frightened kings. Land can be conquered. Water remembers nothing. Whatever left those harbors carried more than men. It carried decisions made long before swords were drawn. Justice had come too late. And the ocean had already closed the door. The fleet did not leave empty-handed. That much was certain. Even in the quiet of the empty harbors, whispers spoke of chests and bundles carefully loaded. Not gold alone, though some went with them, but items far older and far more dangerous in their value. I first heard the story from an old sailor, a man whose hands were rough as rope but whose eyes remembered too much. He had seen the ships at sea from a distance, sails black against the moon, and noticed the care with which they carried their cargo. They were heavy, he said, weighted, not with stone or iron. Something else. And there it begins, the question that has haunted historians for centuries. What did they take with them? The Templars had always been keepers of knowledge. Scrolls, ledgers, codices, contracts, debts, agreements, some dating back decades, some centuries. Records that mapped influence, revealed alliances, and noted secrets meant for eyes of power alone. But that night, they took more than records. They carried artifacts whose worth could never be measured in coin. Objects bound by faith, by legend, by fear. The kind of items that make kings uneasy when whispers reach their ears. Some say the holy relics, the cup, the cross, the things held so sacred in Paris, were among the cargo. Others insist the fleet carried something more practical, evidence. Proof of debts owed by kings. Records of favors never repaid. Documents that could topple the most secure of thrones. It is difficult to know for sure. Official records tell nothing. They were silent on purpose. But the stories survive. I followed one of these whispers to a small inn near La Rochelle, where a former Templar servant had been hiding. He was old, hunched over, voice barely audible over the fire. He claimed that the ships had been stocked with treasures designed to survive, not just wealth, but survival itself. Each chest, he said, was marked with its keeper's name. Each man had a burden to carry. If one fell, the other continued. That coordination impressed even the most seasoned sailors. No cargo was left behind. Nothing was misplaced. It is said that the fleet sailed in lines, meticulously arranged, forming a protective chain around the cargo. Nothing left to chance. Every ship a guardian. The weight of secrecy was greater than the weight of the cargo itself. Every man understood the risk. To fail meant not just death, but the end of what they were sworn to protect. Some of the relics carried were spiritual in nature, objects of devotion meant to inspire faith. Some were practical, items that could feed, arm, and shelter men far from home. And some were dangerous, knowledge that could destroy the lives of those who misused it. I have spoken with scholars who try to identify the cargo by cross-referencing shipping logs, letters, and fragmentary notes from the time. They find nothing conclusive. The fleet was organized to erase all traces. Yet hints remain. A ledger here, a partial inventory there. Mentions of silver, cloth, food stores, but always in a way that disguises the true value of what moved. The Templars had learned the hardest lesson in history. Power without preparation is meaningless. The king may seize land, may imprison men, may burn leaders alive, but it cannot seize what leaves silently and intentionally. As I listened to the old servant, I realized the most important thing was not the cargo itself. It was the message. A message carried across the waves. We survive. We endure. We are not yours to control. And in that, the Templars accomplished what no sword or army could. They defied kings without confrontation. They preserved their secrets without speaking them aloud. For centuries, people have speculated where the fleet went, what became of the cargo, and whether any of it survived intact. Legends suggest the ships reached distant lands, Portugal, Scotland, even Ireland. Some whisper of voyages beyond known waters, seeking lands untouched by European crowns. But even if the fleet splintered, even if men died or artifacts were lost, the principle remained. The order had left France intact in spirit, if not in body. The message of resistance, foresight, and loyalty had been carried across the waves, untouched by the king's fury. And as I write this, centuries later, I feel the weight of that night. Not for gold, not for glory, but for knowledge. For the understanding that some things, once protected, can never be destroyed. The Templars knew this. They acted with precision. And that precision allowed them to survive what should have been total annihilation. King Philip IV believed in the certainty of power. He believed that law, force, and fear could control men, even knights sworn to God. He believed that by arresting the Templars, seizing their wealth, and burning their leaders, he had ended the threat. But he was wrong. I learned this not from books, but from the words of a court scribe who had been present during the aftermath of the arrests. He described the king's frustration in painstaking detail. Philip had planned everything. Every command, every step. Yet nothing unfolded as intended. The first blow came with the news of the fleet. The missing ships were not merely an inconvenience, they were a wound to his pride. A calculated plan executed by men who had anticipated his every move. A fleet disappearing without resistance was proof that Philip's control was never complete. The court tried to maintain an appearance of success. Executions continued. Confessions were broadcast. Grand Master Jacques de Molay, bound and defiant, became the face of supposed justice. Yet behind closed doors, the king's fury was tangible. Advisors whispered of lost treasures, secrets carried into unknown lands, debts unpaid, and alliances unbroken. Every piece of property or document seized felt hollow, incomplete. The Templars had removed the heart of their influence, leaving only the bones. The king demanded answers. He demanded someone to blame. He ordered officials to retrace every step, interrogate every harbormaster, and question every sailor. All returned the same answer. The ships left as if they were never theirs. Humiliation spread quietly among the nobles. Where once they had feared Philip's reach, they now noticed cracks. No one dared openly challenge him, but whispers filled the halls. Some suggested that the Templars had allies who had warned them in advance. Others suspected that France itself contained men who could not, or would not, submit to the king's will. Philip's obsession with vengeance only worsened matters. He increased taxes, ordered more arrests, and pursued even minor nobles suspected of sympathizing with the order. The people grew restless. Merchants complained. Harbor towns that once thrived under Templar trade began to falter. Meanwhile, the king's justice became performative. Trials were held, but the outcomes were obvious. Executions satisfied appearances but left the underlying problem untouched. The fleet, the knowledge, the secrets, they were still out there. In private, Philip reportedly attempted to track the ships personally, dispatching envoys to Iberia, England, and even farther west. But the waters are vast. Maps are imperfect. And those who leave with purpose can always stay hidden. Some historians claim the king grew paranoid during this time. He began suspecting his own court. Allies who had served him faithfully suddenly seemed dangerous. Letters were opened, envoys monitored, and suspicion replaced trust. It is no exaggeration to say that the Templars' escape undermined the foundation of his reign more than any battlefield loss could have. The crown retained its outward authority, yes. But the illusion of total control had been shattered. Stories spread quietly across France. Merchants and sailors spoke of the fleet in hushed tones. Even commoners began to question how a group so despised, so hunted, could disappear so completely. The narrative Philip had carefully constructed, of a victorious king and a vanquished enemy, was slowly eroding. The king's advisors argued endlessly over next steps. Some suggested more arrests. Others demanded negotiation. But with no clear target, there could be no meaningful retaliation. And then came the most troubling news of all. Documents and letters that had been thought seized were found missing from royal archives. Not destroyed, not stolen in the open, but gone. No one could explain it. Those who had been entrusted with them were either dead, imprisoned, or vanished themselves. I remember thinking as I copied records in my small chamber near the Seine, that the Templars had understood something crucial that the king did not. Power is never absolute. Even kings are limited. Even the strongest reach only as far as their knowledge allows. By the end of that year, Philip's vengeance had begun to falter. The order was officially dissolved. Grand Master de Molay would be executed. Yet the real threat, the fleet, the knowledge, the preparation, remained beyond reach. And perhaps most importantly, the king learned that the Templars' influence had not ended. It had merely migrated. Across oceans, into shadows, into whispers that no crown could silence. Some say this is why Philip's reign became marked by unease. He faced uprisings, bankruptcies, and political strife he could not fully control. The weight of unseen enemies, men and knowledge he could not touch, haunted him until his death. The lesson was clear: vengeance can destroy lives. But it cannot destroy preparation, foresight, and loyalty. And in the case of the Templars, it could not destroy a fleet moving silently into the unknown. No one expected the fleet to be real. Not the king. Not his advisors. Not the chroniclers who later wrote the history books. And yet, it existed. I learned of this from an old mapmaker living near La Rochelle, decades after the events. His hands were worn, his eyes clouded, but his memory was sharp. He claimed to have seen the ships at sea before the horizon swallowed them whole. They were lined up like soldiers, he said. Not scattered like refugees. Organized. Silent. Unstoppable. This detail was crucial. A fleet of ships moving in formation implies command, strategy, and purpose. It implies knowledge that extends beyond immediate orders. It implies intelligence. Most fleets of the period were simple. Merchant ships sailed when profit demanded. Warships moved when battle required. But this fleet, this Templar fleet, was neither simple nor reactive. It was deliberate. No one knew where it was going. Yet the coordination suggested a destination. A plan. The ships themselves were not extraordinary in size. Nor were their crews unmatched in skill. But the fleet was extraordinary in design. Every captain knew only his route and his cargo. No one had the full picture. I spoke with a sailor who had seen a Templar vessel from the coast. He remembered the discipline, every rope coiled perfectly, every sail aligned. No shouting, no confusion, no mistakes. A fleet moving like a single entity. That is why the crown could not catch them. They could not pursue what moved with certainty and secrecy. And the sea, vast and merciless, was their ally. Some records suggest the fleet split after several days. Others insist it remained united until disappearing beyond the last charted waters. What is certain is that the ships carried men, knowledge, and items that could not survive the fires of Paris or the king's courts. The fleet's existence challenges our understanding of medieval logistics. How could a fleet of dozens of ships depart unnoticed, well supplied, and coordinated in a kingdom under surveillance? The answer lies not in magic or luck, but in preparation. 4 months, the Templars had readied every detail. Supplies were stored in advance. Crews were trained and rotated to prevent suspicion. Cargo was labeled and secured, each man aware of his duty. The king believed he had controlled everything. But the Templars understood that control is an illusion. And that illusion is fragile. I sometimes imagine the fleet at sea that night. Lanterns extinguished, sails catching the wind. Knights standing at the rail, calm, silent, resolute. Men who had faced kings and armies, now facing the unknown. The fleet carried more than what could be counted. It carried a message. We are more than our land. We are more than our enemies' reach. We endure. Historians debate the fleet's route. Some claim Portugal. Others say Scotland. Some whisper of lands further west, beyond charts, beyond knowledge. Whatever the destination, the fleet existed long enough to ensure survival. Long enough to preserve secrets. Long enough to frustrate kings. And that is why it is so remarkable. A fleet that shouldn't exist, yet does. A fleet that moves silently, deliberately, beyond the reach of power. A fleet that transforms disappearance into strategy. By the time reports reached Paris, the crown realized the truth. They had punished men on land. They had seized buildings. They had burned documents. But the fleet, the knowledge, the future, it had left without resistance. And in that moment, the king understood a terrifying lesson. Power is limited. The sea is not. And foresight can outmatch any throne. The night the fleet disappeared into open water, the horizon swallowed more than just sails. It swallowed certainty. It swallowed the king's sense of control. And it swallowed the lives of men who had no choice but to trust the plan. I often wonder what it was like aboard those ships. The wind cold, the waves relentless, the darkness complete. Men who had never seen such expanses of water had to navigate by the stars, by intuition, by a memory of maps long memorized. No king could command this journey. No army could enforce it. It was survival by knowledge, by preparation, by trust. The cargo was secured. Every chest, scroll, and artifact accounted for. Every man knew his duty. And yet, there was fear. Not the fear of the king, not the fear of death, but the fear of the unknown. The Black Atlantic is unforgiving. Storms appear without warning. Currents can drag even the strongest ship into despair. Supplies must last. Water must be rationed. Food must be guarded. And still, the fleet moved steadily westward, as if guided by some unseen hand. I spoke with a navigator who had later sailed near the presumed route. He claimed the Templars' movements were too precise for chance. They sailed with knowledge, he said. Knowledge of tides, of currents, of winds. not just maps, but of nature itself. Some of the knights on board were seasoned mariners. Others had been trained quickly, their skills sharpened in secret. Together, they formed a disciplined line. Each ship protected the next. Each captain understood that failure meant not only death, but the loss of the Order's future. Night after night, the horizon remained black. No lights to guide them, no signals to betray them. The ships moved silently. Men spoke little. Every word could be misinterpreted, every gesture noted, every mistake fatal. It is said that the fleet carried messages for allies unknown to the king. Letters and ledgers documenting debts, treaties, and agreements. Power, after all, is not only swords and walls, it is information. And the Templars had taken it all with them. The king's messengers arrived at distant ports too late. They found docks empty. Ships departed. Goods unaccounted for. Stories dismissed as rumors. Yet the Templars were not fleeing blindly. They had a destination, and that destination was deliberate. Some whisper it was Scotland, where the crown's reach was limited. Others claim they sailed to the western edge of Europe, seeking ports sympathetic or neutral. A few even suggest they attempted voyages further west, into waters unmapped, unknown, unclaimed. The fleet's endurance speaks volumes about the discipline of the Order. For men trained to fight on land, to navigate the open sea, to carry their sacred cargo without error, required a precision unmatched in their time. It required planning, courage, and faith, not in religion alone, but in their brothers, in their purpose, and in the silent code that bound them. And yet, even with their skills, the Atlantic is merciless. Storms struck without warning. Rain battered sails. Waves threatened to swallow ships whole. Some crews faltered. Some fell ill. But the fleet pressed onward, each ship a guardian of the Order's future. Stories from sailors in the years following speak of ghostly sightings. Ships appearing on the horizon, then vanishing. Silent vessels in formation. White crosses cutting the dark waves. Men who glimpsed them whispered tales, afraid to write them down, afraid to give them life on paper. The Templars' goal was not conquest. It was survival. Preservation of knowledge, of power beyond the king's grasp, of a secret world that could endure beyond borders. By the time the first lights of land appeared, if land was even their true aim, the fleet had transformed from a group of fleeing ships into a symbol of defiance. A reminder that preparation, loyalty, and foresight can outmatch even the most powerful monarchs. The Black Atlantic swallowed them from sight, but not from memory. Stories traveled back, slowly, carried by rumor, by whispers, by men who had glimpsed the truth but could not touch it. And in that silence, history began to shift. Not in chronicles or records, but in the unseen influence of men who moved unseen, carrying the power of knowledge into shadows the king could never reach. The fleet's first glimpses of land were met with both relief and apprehension. After weeks at sea, exhaustion weighed heavier than the cargo. Men were thin, eyes hollow from sleepless nights and the constant watch of waves. The ships had survived storms, hidden currents, and the ever-present threat of pursuit, but the unknown now lay before them. Wherever they landed, it could be safety. Or it could be worse than the king's soldiers. I have spoken to descendants of sailors who claimed their ancestors were aboard the fleet. They told me the landing was cautious, deliberate. No one stepped ashore until the tide and timing were exact. Every captain knew the risk. Even distant eyes could report their presence to France. They landed first in small, unguarded harbors, places overlooked by the crown. Some were abandoned by merchants. Others were neutral towns where rumors of Templar activity were met with silence rather than hostility. But neutrality did not always mean welcome. The Templars had to navigate politics as carefully as they had navigated the sea. Even in foreign ports, loyalties shifted with wind and ruler. A misstep could lead to capture, betrayal, or worse. Some knights remained on board, patrolling the fleet, guarding cargo and knowledge. Others went ashore to negotiate provisions quietly. The mission required discretion. Visibility meant risk. Rumors of Templars arriving in fleets would reach the ears of enemies. Stories travel faster than ships, after all. The cargo was inspected at each stop. Chests were opened, items inventoried. Nothing could be left unattended. Maps and ledgers were copied, some even buried temporarily on shore for safekeeping. Every action was deliberate, every movement calculated. It is said that in one small Iberian port, the knights encountered a group of men who were curious, cautious, and armed. They were not soldiers, yet they questioned the newcomers' presence. One misstep could have led to conflict. But the Templars handled it quietly, offering only what was necessary: trades, assurances, and polite obedience to local law. That balance, between appearing harmless and preserving their purpose, was critical. Too aggressive, and they would attract enemies. Too passive, and they might appear weak, inviting attack. In this new land, the fleet also faced natural dangers. Currents unfamiliar. Shallow reefs. Unmapped coves. And the Atlantic wind, always unpredictable, threatened to scatter ships or crush them against cliffs. Yet the men endured. They navigated by stars, by memory, by charts few could read. Each captain relied on discipline and trust, and the code of the order held firm. Follow the plan, protect the cargo, survive. Some chroniclers later suggested that the Templars split into smaller groups. Each went its own way, carrying fragments of knowledge, artifacts, and men. This would reduce risk of capture and allow some to return if others were lost. But even in dispersal, the same rules applied: loyalty, silence, preparation. No one acted alone. Every action had a purpose. Every choice was guided by foresight. The idea of safe lands was a relative one. For the Templars, safety was measured not by distance from the king, but by the ability to continue their mission. To protect what must survive. To carry secrets beyond reach. And yet, the threat of enemies never disappeared. France was not their only danger. Pirates, rival orders, and local rulers could all pose risks. The knights understood that survival required more than courage. It required intelligence and discretion. In some harbors, they were observed. Reports were sent, sometimes reaching distant courts. But by the time any pursuer arrived, the fleet had moved on, leaving only whispers and empty docks behind. It is in this phase of the journey that the Templars' foresight is most evident. They had prepared not only for storms and shipwrecks, but for politics, suspicion, and human greed. Every landing was a test of patience, diplomacy, and courage. By the time they reached lands less charted, rumors of the fleet began to fade. Only those who had been at the docks, those who had glimpsed shadows of sails at dawn, remembered. For the world, the Templars had vanished. But for those who knew the truth, their presence remained a silent warning. The order endured, and its secrets traveled with them. By the time the Templars reached lands far from France, the weight of their mission had grown heavier. Not just the weight of chests and cargo, but the responsibility of carrying knowledge that could alter kingdoms. Every decision mattered. Every misstep could undo decades of preparation. What is remarkable about this period is how much relied on memory. Not every record survived. Not every document was copied. Some things had to be remembered, passed from one knight to another without writing. Secrets transmitted orally, in coded phrases, gestures, and silent understanding. I once spoke with a man whose grandfather had served as a scribe for one of the fleet's captains. He described long nights aboard the ship, when lanterns were dimmed and whispers carried across decks. Lessons were taught quietly. Codes were reinforced. Maps were memorized, then destroyed. You don't write what cannot be risked, the old man said. You carry it in your mind. You protect it in your silence. This method ensured that if any ship were captured, the most critical secrets would remain beyond the enemy's reach. Not only knowledge of debts, treasures, and alliances, but also of strategy, safe harbors, and loyal contacts. It is easy to assume that the Templars fled blindly. Nothing could be further from the truth. Every ship, every crew member, every chest had a purpose. The order had transformed from a static institution into a moving network of guardians. They trained for this while under siege. Years of discipline, secrecy, and loyalty became crucial in this moment. Each man knew the importance of his silence. Each man understood that one careless word could undo all they had survived. Some of these secrets were mundane, yet vital: which portmasters could be trusted, where supplies could be hidden, and how to signal allies without raising suspicion. Others were dangerous. Knowledge of debts owed by kings, letters detailing alliances, and documents that could compromise lives if revealed. I was told that the Templars developed subtle signals. A gesture in the wind. The arrangement of a sail. A pattern of knots in ropes. Every small detail communicated meaning to those trained to understand. In essence, they created a language of silence. A network of understanding that allowed them to coordinate across ships, across distance, without a word reaching the wrong ears. This is the part of history that official records ignore. No chronicle speaks of secret codes and whispered instructions. Yet the success of the fleet, the survival of cargo and men, proves they existed. And the secret lives on. It is not written in any library. It is remembered in fragments. In maps annotated by hand. In letters never sent. In stories passed down from one family to another, often half forgotten, always cautious. I sometimes wonder how much knowledge was lost despite their careful planning. The sea is indifferent to human intent. Storms, accidents, and illness claimed lives and memories. Yet what survived was enough to maintain the Order's influence in shadow. These secrets were not merely protective. They were a statement. The Order was more than its physical presence. It could survive without buildings, without gold, without recognition. It could endure wherever its members were disciplined and loyal. It is said that when the fleet eventually reached more remote coasts, the Knights established temporary safe havens. There were no fortresses, no large settlements. Just small hidden enclaves where knowledge could be safeguarded, where men could teach each other the lessons of silence, and where cargo could be redistributed. In these places, the secrets were reinforced. New generations learned the code. Maps were memorized, destroyed, then passed along again. Trust became more important than authority. It was here, in the unrecorded corners of the world, that the Templars' influence continued, not visible to the crowns or historians of the time, but alive in memory and method. For the king, for his advisors, and for the chroniclers, this phase never existed. In official history, the Order ended with fire, chains, and public spectacle. In reality, it moved silently, carrying not only its treasures but its knowledge, its planning, and its loyalty. And in this silent persistence, the Templars proved something extraordinary. Even the most meticulous attempt at destruction cannot erase what is carried in mind and memory. After the fleet disappeared and the Templars settled into hidden enclaves, a peculiar phenomenon began across Europe. It wasn't armies marching. It wasn't letters threatening kingdoms. It was silence. This silence terrified rulers far more than open conflict could. No one knew where the Templars were. No one could find their leaders, their wealth, or their fleets. Yet the Order's influence lingered. I learned about this from letters and chronicles pieced together over decades. Merchants wrote of contracts left unpaid. Kings wrote of debts that could not be collected. All of them whispered of missing allies and mysterious correspondences arriving without clear origin. Europe grew uneasy. Courts became suspicious, not only of Templars, but of one another. Who could be trusted if one order could vanish entirely? Every rumor was amplified. Every quiet action suspected. Even trivial mistakes were interpreted as evidence of complicity with the disappeared knights. It is said that this quiet influence reached as far as England, Portugal, and Scotland. Ships that had seen the Templar fleet at sea reported stories of disciplined lines moving silently, disappearing into fog or night. Merchants and harbor officials wrote warnings to their kings. Some vessels were not ordinary. They bore men who were prepared, who observed, who remembered. In some ways, the Templars had transformed the perception of power. Previously, authority was measured by walls, armies, and titles. Now it was measured by presence, or rather, absence. Men began to understand that control cannot exist when knowledge and planning escape it. Even within France, those who had been close to the arrests whispered that the fleet's disappearance had created paranoia at court. Philip IV could no longer trust advisors, clerks, or sailors. Every message could hide a plot. Every arrival could be a Templar in disguise. This silence became a tool, almost more powerful than the fleet itself. No battle was fought openly. No lands were conquered. Yet kings and rulers, accustomed to controlling armies and enforcing law, felt powerless. Because the Templars had proven that survival and influence do not require visibility. I remember speaking with a historian who specialized in maritime records. He said the Atlantic and western coasts were forever altered by what he called the ghost presence. Ships vanished into fog. Sailors feared being intercepted by unseen adversaries. Ports reported odd movements of people, whispers of messages delivered without origin. Some of the Templars' silent influence was practical. Safe passages were established for trade. Allies were quietly supported. Knowledge was shared sparingly with those deemed trustworthy. But some of it was psychological. The idea that an unseen hand could move across kingdoms without detection unsettled even the bravest men. Rumors spread faster than armies could march. Fear replaced certainty. And uncertainty is far more dangerous than open conflict. This period is rarely documented. Most chronicles focus on trials, executions, and the king's vengeance. Yet the silence, the quiet, unseen power, was the real story. Because it demonstrates a truth historians often overlook: control is fragile. Authority is temporary. And knowledge, when protected and moved wisely, can survive every attempt at destruction. In the years that followed, the Templars became a phantom. Stories of their presence circulated, but no evidence was concrete. Their relics, their knowledge, and their discipline persisted in ways that no crown could erase. Europe had faced armies, conspiracies, and rebellion. Yet none of these compared to the quiet terror inspired by men who could vanish entirely. And that is why the silence of the Templars terrified rulers for decades to come. After months at sea and cautious landings, the Templars began to establish themselves in ways that were deliberate yet invisible. They sought lands that offered both refuge and opportunity. Harbors where they could rest, resupply, and remain unnoticed. And in these places, they forged new allegiances, quietly, carefully. It was not easy. Europe was a web of politics, loyalties, and rivalries. Every port they approached carried the risk of betrayal. Even towns considered neutral could turn hostile if the wrong rumor spread. I learned of this stage from descendants of sailors and merchants who had encountered the fleet in hidden coves. They described Templars negotiating quietly with local leaders. No grand proclamations. No demands. Just exchanges of trust and discreet agreements. The Templars offered knowledge, trade connections, and protection. In return, they secured safe harbors, supplies, and loyal allies. Every new relationship was deliberate. Every new agreement reinforced the network of survival. This is where the order transformed. Once a military and religious power concentrated in castles and commanderies, it became a distributed network. Cells of loyal men, each capable of independent action, connected by trust and shared knowledge. Some knights remained at sea, patrolling the coasts, keeping watch. Others ventured inland, ensuring that their new allies could defend their enclaves. Messages traveled between groups using the codes they had perfected: gestures, signals, and secret markers. The order's strength no longer relied on proximity, it relied on discipline, foresight, and communication. There were challenges. Local rulers were sometimes suspicious. Pirates roamed the coasts. And resources were not unlimited. Yet the Templars adapted. They shared knowledge of navigation, trade, and defense, proving their value without revealing too much. Some historians speculate that these new alliances explain the enduring myths of hidden Templar influence across Europe. Ports and cities where they were rumored to have settled became centers of quiet economic growth, trade, and protection. Not through conquest, but through guidance and subtle intervention. The order also had to manage internal discipline. Men who had survived the fleet's journey were tested again. Trust had to be earned and reaffirmed. Even one lapse could compromise the entire network. I have records suggesting that training continued in these enclaves. Knights were taught to navigate, negotiate, and protect information. Every member understood that their survival depended on both secrecy and loyalty. In some regions, the Templars integrated into local communities while maintaining independence. They became advisors, merchants, and occasionally military consultants. But always, the focus was preservation, not power. They sought to endure, not dominate. These new horizons also allowed for the recovery and redistribution of the fleet's cargo. Relics, documents, and treasures were inventoried, secured, and in some cases, concealed further. Nothing was left vulnerable. Every item had a guardian, every secret a keeper. By the time the first years passed, the Templars had created a network that spanned coasts and inland regions. Not an empire. Not a visible army. But a system that could survive attacks, disappearances, and attempts at eradication. The king may have thought he had destroyed them. History may have recorded their fall. But in these hidden enclaves, the order proved something remarkable. Even after betrayal, arrest, and near annihilation, preparation, loyalty, and strategy could create a second life. A life beyond visibility. A life capable of shaping events quietly, subtly, yet powerfully. Even as the Templars settled into new lands and forged discreet alliances, Europe continued to believe the order had been destroyed. Publicly, their name was condemned. Churches preached against them. Chroniclers wrote of their downfall in vivid detail. But the truth moved quietly beneath the surface, in whispers, shadows, and coded messages. I first encountered one of these whispers in a coastal town in northern Iberia. A merchant, old and cautious, spoke of travelers arriving at night, their banners unseen, their purpose unspoken. "They are not soldiers," he said. "They are not thieves. But you feel their presence. And you know they know things that could ruin kings and merchants alike if revealed." This was the essence of the hidden order. They no longer needed visibility. They did not need fortresses or armies. They needed knowledge, loyalty, and discretion. The fleet's dispersal had created small pockets of Templar influence. Men who had once been bound by strict hierarchy now operated semi-independently. Each group guarded its own secrets while remaining part of the greater network. Messages traveled in subtle ways. A folded note concealed in merchant cargo. A coded marking on a rope. A sequence of knots in a fisherman's net. Even casual gestures could carry meaning to those trained to understand. I spoke with descendants of these enclaves, people who had grown up hearing tales of strange visitors and mysterious shipments. They remembered lessons passed down silently. Trust, but verify. Protect what must survive. Never reveal everything. Europe's rulers, meanwhile, remained frustrated. Even years after the arrests, the Templars' influence lingered. Kings could seize lands, execute men, and confiscate gold, but the order persisted in ways unseen. Its impact was subtle but undeniable. Contracts honored, trade routes protected, allies informed, enemies checked. In some regions, people began to call them ghost knights. Figures who appeared when needed, vanished before confrontation. Stories spread along coasts, through ports, and across forests. Rumors of their arrival, whether true or exaggerated, became enough to enforce behavior. This whisper network was the most powerful legacy of the escape. It demonstrated that true power is not always about armies or wealth. It is about influence, strategy, and timing. And yet, the order remained vigilant. Even decades after the fleet vanished, every knight understood that secrecy was survival. The king's agents might still be searching. Curiosity, greed, or ambition could compromise even the smallest detail. The Templars adapted. New recruits were trained to move silently. New allies were vetted carefully. Old codes were reinforced and modified. I have traced several of these enclaves over the years. They were small, often temporary, yet remarkably resilient. Some survived decades, passing their knowledge quietly from one generation to the next. Even when the world believed the order dead, its influence remained. Merchants prospered where they guided trade. Communities flourished under their quiet protection. Enemies who underestimated them found opportunities denied. In essence, the Templars had become a shadow power. Visible to few, influential to many, feared by those who sensed but could not see. This is why historians struggle to explain the years following the official dissolution. Records claim an end. In reality, the order had simply changed its form. No longer centralized, no longer conspicuous, yet enduring, strategic, and alive. And in this silence, they proved something extraordinary. Even after betrayal, imprisonment, and near annihilation, knowledge and preparation could outlast kings. Even when forgotten by history, influence could persist. By this time, decades had passed since the fleet first vanished from French harbors. Europe had moved on, or at least, believed it had. Kings changed. Wars were fought. Chronicles recorded only what could be seen, measured, or burned. Yet the Templars' legacy continued quietly, beyond the reach of courts and chroniclers. I have traveled through coastal villages, inland towns, and ancient ports tracing fragments of that influence. I listened to stories passed down by families whose ancestors had encountered the order. Not as rulers, not as conquerors, but as advisors, protectors, and custodians of knowledge. These enclaves were small but effective. They operated like veins, spreading guidance, protection, and information. Even when separated by hundreds of miles, the Templars maintained cohesion through the codes, signals, and lessons preserved from the fleet. Merchants who survived encounters with them remembered rules enforced quietly. Fair trade. Protection of allies. No betrayal. It is said that some knights ventured further, reaching lands that were scarcely mapped. Ireland, Scotland, and parts of the Iberian Peninsula became sanctuaries. Even parts of the North Atlantic and Mediterranean held hidden enclaves that were virtually invisible to rulers of the day. The fleet's cargo, knowledge, relics, documents, was carefully distributed. Nothing remained centralized. Nothing vulnerable. What could be taught orally was taught. What needed secrecy was locked away, moved from safe place to safe place. By dispersing both men and materials, the Templars ensured that the order's influence could not be entirely destroyed. I spoke with a historian who had examined records of Iberian ports. He suggested that these settlements contributed to a subtle shift in power dynamics. Local lords gained advantage not through armies alone, but through access to information and resources quietly provided by Templars. Merchants prospered because trade networks were safeguarded. Communities that were once vulnerable became stable, all without outward recognition. This legacy also ensured that, should Europe attempt another purge, the Templars could rebuild. Not with open war, but with preparation, loyalty, and influence already in place. By the time kings recognized the disappearance, the order was already entrenched, dispersed, and difficult to target. Even relics carried by the fleet played a part in this quiet legacy. Some were used to establish trust in foreign ports. Others were safeguarded for generations, never revealed, yet always signaling continuity and authority to those who knew their value. The order's transformation from a centralized force to a dispersed network demonstrated a truth that few rulers understood. Power is fleeting, but knowledge, loyalty, and preparation endure. A king may burn leaders. He may seize castles. He may destroy armies. But he cannot erase memory, discipline, and secrecy once it has been mastered. By the end of this period, the Templars had achieved something remarkable. They had survived annihilation, imprisonment, and the fury of one of the most powerful kings in Europe. They had adapted to a world that sought to erase them. And they had created a network that could endure beyond the limitations of land, armies, or even time. In essence, the legacy of the Order no longer relied on visibility or fear. It relied on foresight, loyalty, and the quiet, deliberate influence of men who understood that survival is more than survival. It is endurance. Centuries have passed since the Templars vanished from France. Kings, empires, and armies have risen and fallen. Yet the essence of the Order, the fleet, the knowledge, the discipline, lives on, hidden in plain sight. I have traced threads of this influence in the most unexpected places. Coastal towns where trade prospered quietly, inland villages with unusually organized defense, families whose ancestors passed down stories of strangers who arrived at night to advise, protect, or guide. None bore the Order's name openly, but the method survived. The fleet's disappearance, once considered a failure of the Crown to enforce justice, became a masterclass in foresight and strategy. Men trained to follow orders, protect knowledge, and endure without recognition had created a system no king could conquer. Even the powerful Philip IV could not erase it, though he tried through fire, chains, and decree. By spreading their influence across ports, coasts, and inland settlements, the Templars created a network that was more than men or ships. It was a living, breathing system of loyalty, secrecy, and silent authority. They proved that influence does not require visibility, and survival does not require recognition. I have seen signs of the Order even centuries later. Symbols carved subtly into buildings, relics preserved in private hands, documents passed in secrecy, and even codes embedded in maps and letters. Each is a fragment of the original fleet's mission, a reminder that the Order was never truly destroyed. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of their survival is psychological. The fear, the respect, and the uncertainty they instilled among rulers persisted long after the fleet sailed beyond the known seas. It became a lesson in power. Unseen, disciplined, and prepared forces can shape the world without a sword drawn in anger. The Templars' story is more than one of escape. It is a story of resilience, intelligence, and foresight. It is a story of men who chose endurance over immediate victory, secrecy over spectacle, and preparation over brute force. And so, the invisible Order lives on. Not in fortresses or titles. Not in gold or armies. But in the principles they mastered: loyalty, discretion, and the quiet, deliberate influence that cannot be destroyed by kings, armies, or time. Even today, those who look closely, who understand the power of silence, memory, and strategy, can see traces of their presence. In hidden enclaves, in lessons passed down, and in whispers of history that refuse to die. The fleet may have vanished. The Grand Masters may have fallen. But the Order endures. Silent. Invisible. Unstoppable. And that is why the story of the Templars is not only history. It is a lesson in survival, strategy, and the enduring power of the invisible.